Hello and welcome to a special edition of the U2 Concast. We're celebrating 20 years of PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was a project that Bono was very active in with the One campaign and data. And in that light, we have invited Tom Hart. He is the president of the One campaign, which is a nonpartisan advocacy and campaigning organization that fights extreme poverty and preventable disease, particularly in Africa, by raising public awareness and working with political leaders to support effective policies and programs that save lives. I am your host, Angela Pancella, and I am pleased to say hello to Tom Hart. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Angela. Thanks so much for having me on. This is great.
I really appreciate it. I'm absolutely thrilled. You have a long history with One and data. Tell me how you got involved.
Yeah, well, I do. I've been here since we were founded 20 years ago. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary of Data and One, as well as PEPFAR. We sort of got going around the same time PEPFAR did. I used to work for the Episcopal Church. The National Episcopal Church has a government relations office. Actually, most of the churches and other faith groups do too. And so the issue, we all worked together on what was called the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which was to relieve the unpayable debts that burdened poor countries such as in Africa, where frankly, they were spending more on interest payments to countries like the US and the UK and France, as well as the World Bank and IMF. They were spending more on interest payments than they were in health and education in those in their own countries. And that was built up of 30 years of unpayable debts. So this was an effort led by the faith communities to relieve those debts and redirect those savings to human needs. That's how I got to know Bono. That's how a group of us started to work together. We all work for different organizations. And after that pretty successful effort around debt cancellation, not pretty successful, very successful effort around debt cancellation, $100 billion of debt was relieved and sort of gave a fresh start to countries. We all wanted to keep working together. A curious set of relationships, particularly in Washington, but around the world came together. Right and left, street activists and intellectuals, and we wanted to keep those networks together. And we knew that while we had been focusing on debt, the scourge of HIV/AIDS was ravaging, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Any savings we were going to get from debt relief were going to be completely swallowed up by HIV. Something like 5,500 people were dying every day from HIV, a preventable, treatable disease in the West, but where there just simply was no access. I think only 50,000 people in Africa at the time had access to the antiretroviral drug regimens, which, if you remember at the time, were $10,000 to $15,000 a year, and dozens of pills that some had to be taken with food and some without at different times of the day. So the idea that we were going to help not just prevent but treat people with from this disease in faraway places at that cost and at that sort of technological challenge was almost unthinkable at the time. It seems obvious now because we've got it down to one pill a day, and we've got it's just it's like $100, and it's always was it Nelson Mandela that said it always seems impossible until it's done. This is absolutely a case like that. So that's how I got started, and we created Data, which stood for Debt, AIDS, Trade, Africa, and then morphed that into the One campaign, and I've been there ever since.
I'm curious. I don't know if I've heard the story of where Data kind of merged and what that merger looked like and how that came about. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Sure, I can. It gets a little wonky and technical, but the very brief version is Data, which is and everyone thought we were a tech company. So we realized that wasn't probably the best foot forward, but the Data, Debt, AIDS, Trade, Africa really created the One campaign as a project outside the Beltway to galvanize voters to weigh in with their elected leaders. And it was we did it in conjunction with a bunch of other partners like World Vision and Bread for the World and many others. So it started as a project within Data, then it grew into this coalition. Then we spun it off as its own 501c3, for those of you who are technical, its own legal entity with its own board and funding and all the rest. And Data and One coexisted. We shared office space together for some time, and then we realized for budget reasons and for branding reasons, it was a little strange that Bono and Bill Gates had started these two things. One was about mobilizing voters, and the other was about inside advocacy. Well, we clearly need to bring those together, and One was just a much better name, and it made sense to people, and was really the thing that we were branding externally. So that's how we merged Data and One.
Gotcha. Well, take us back into the weeds a bit of the whole advocacy around the treatment and prevention of HIV/AIDS that became PEPFAR as a major locus, although of course there's plenty of other activities around AIDS and HIV relief. But what do you have particular memories of those early moments?
I do. Well, so many stories, and I'll try not to go too long and take your questions, but there were really four things, sort of streams that came together. One was an incredible need, and let's not forget, like, not having a clear demonstrable need, you know, the body bags piling up, and I hate to be gruesome, but it was really the growth industry in many sub-Saharan African countries was coffin making. It was just a catastrophic, cataclysmic event, and without a lot of hope. So very, very clear felt need. There was an inside Washington effort that is not well remembered. Senator Frist, and who was a doctor, or still is a doctor, senator from Tennessee, and John Kerry, who of course is still around, working in the State Department, working on climate change. But those two worked together along with Barbara Lee and Jim Colby, bipartisan, in the House, and introduced the first legislation to have the United States do much more in the fight against the global pandemic. They were fairly modest in comparison with what was finally agreed, but they got the conversation started in Washington about, hey, what can we do with treatment? What can we do more on prevention? Secondly, third, I should say, there was an outside game. There were activists like us saying, you've got to do something. We worked with media partners. There was so much ink in newspapers at the time, back in the day when there were actual physical newspapers. I know where that dates me in this whole project. There were indeed real protests. There were activists in Africa who were, protesting loud and making it clear that they wanted and were demanding the drugs that we could have easy access here in the West. And then I got to hand it to President Bush. That fourth element was leadership. It really does, even with all those other things, someone had to stand up and say, okay, we're going to go, and we're going to go bold. I didn't agree with President Bush on many things, but he absolutely deserves incredible credit. And it's a piece of his legacy, honestly, that he is incredibly proud of. Yeah. So taking that leadership at that level and going, he was presented with a series of options from his team, sort of small, medium, and large. And he chose the most aggressive when he was convinced that it could be. It wasn't really a question, as I understand it from those in the inside, it wasn't a question of whether we should. It was, how big can we go? What's credible here? No one had delivered these medicines in resource poor settings, ever before. And so he was really pushing them on what was doable, and they found out that they could do it and do it big.
I understand Michael Gerson was a major force in that as well. Can you tell us
a little
about that?
He was. Well, Mike Gerson, who probably best known as President Bush's speechwriter, but also speechwriter sort of diminishes the intellectual heft that Michael brought to the West Wing. Michael's clear writing was an indication of extraordinary clear thinking, and he was instrumental. PEPFAR would not have happened without him. Thank you for raising him. We obviously mourn his passing this year. He was a real bright light, and has remained so over the past 20 years. He sort of defined compassionate conservative. He was a staunch conservative, proud Republican who said we should be doing good in the world. We might have a different idea about how that gets done than Democrats. Sometimes we can agree, and he was a real force for change and bipartisan compromise and doing good in the world. Not only was he instrumental in the creation of PEPFAR, he actually orchestrated and led the White House effort around what's called the President's Malaria Initiative. Yeah. It's one of the, other than the Global Fund, it is the largest program on the planet to fight malaria, and Michael really made that happen. So thanks for raising him.
Absolutely. Well, but that actually segues nicely into like some of the nuts and bolts. And again, like the people we're going to be talking to in the concast, they are they come from all walks of life, but I know they're very familiar with the advocacy group, the advocacy work Bono has done,
Yeah,
and the reasons behind it. But I don't know if we really understand all of the technical details. I understand PEPFAR now resides in the State Department. Is that right? There's an
that's right.
ambassador who's in charge.
Yep.
So what does the delivery of funding look like, and resources?
Sure. Well, it's broken broadly into three big categories: treatment, care, and prevention. So the United States Congress generously funds PEPFAR, and we pool those. Sorry, we pool the need in Africa to purchase antiretroviral drugs.
Mhm.
And as I said earlier, they used to be extraordinarily expensive, but now with the change in technology and frankly creating a market in Africa helped lower that price. You know, say Pfizer would have an antiretroviral, but there wouldn't be a market to go in and support fighting AIDS in among the very poor in Malawi. It's just
Right,
too small a population and too poor.
right.
So there wasn't an incentive. But when you create a continental wide marketplace
Mm,
and the purchasing power of the US government, the the pharmaceutical companies came to the table, and we were able to negotiate prices much lower. So that's one thing that PEPFAR does, particularly on treatment. And I, you know, it's so complex. I'm not doing justice to the technical and epidemiological
yeah.
uh, expertise that PEPFAR brings to this, but they are obviously finding, they're doing the blood work and the viral load testing. They've helped build clinics so that that can be done. They get people on to the drugs. They do the follow-up, adherence and staying on your medicine, which is obviously critical. There's better adherence through PEPFAR programs than in many Western states, including the
Mhm,
United States.
mhm,
So the follow-up by community health workers and people coming in to get their medicine is really excellent. Then there's also prevention, where we're obviously trying to keep the virus from spreading. Turns out that getting people on treatment is a preventative measure because you're lowering the amount of virus in their bloodstream, so they
right.
don't pass it along as easily. But there's huge education campaigns, from billboards to community service to working with churches and other community groups. And then lastly, there's care for orphans and vulnerable children, for families impacted. There's an economic, impact, obviously, when you have someone who you're the main breadwinner who's uh, contracted HIV. So this program is really comprehensive. It's data driven. All the healthcare workers are given a small iPad where they track every pill that's given
Mm,
to each
mm.
person, how often, and so there's incredible data. I actually had someone from the Washington, D.C. HIV, so HIV is still remains a problem in the District of Columbia, say there are better data tracking resources in Malawi than there are in the District of Columbia. And
Wow.
I believe it because it's been a real cutting edge program that way.
Mm, mm. I remember very vividly one of the concerts I have a bootleg for, I think, where Bono was talking about a conversation with somebody in Congress who shall remain nameless, saying that well, we can't do this because there's it's a time sensitive thing, and these Africans don't have wristwatches, and
Yes.
the sheer um the befuddlement in Bono's voice recounting this tale, but it actually points to a real reality around the whole question of work with HIV/AIDS is multifaceted because it is public health, and it has to do with sexuality, and it has to do with young people and cultural difference and being sensitive, and also the cautions around white savior mentality too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Tell me about. I'm sure that this has come up both in PEPFAR, but more specifically because this is your place of business, the One campaign. How have you navigated over the years figuring out the best ways to navigate some of these issues?
Well, the simple answer is you have to listen.
Yeah.
You have to partner with those. You can't come with your own solutions from the West to
Right.
Africans' problems.
Right.
They know what they need and how best to deal with it. That isn't a revolutionary comment, but I'll tell you, it is really difficult when you throw in politics and trying to convince people that their bright idea might not serve every situation. So it fundamentally comes down to that partnership. One of the things I'm most excited about one over its evolution over time has been our growth in Africa. We are not only listening more and better and taking our steer from experts and grassroots and others from Africa, we're doing advocacy in Africa. So we're learning that and taking that to our advocacy in the North. But I think it is I think that's the simplest, clearest answer. It's funny that story about the Bush administration official who said, well, you can't possibly give these medicines in Africa because they don't have wristwatches. Obviously is galling to my ears now, and it was then. One of the things that I want to communicate, though, is just that was what was the technological challenge. As I mentioned, it was a dozen different pills taken, some with food, some without, different times of day, and adherence to those regimens in the United States were not great. And so obviously there was unforgivable in my view for this person to paint the entire continent of Africa with that brush. But there was a kernel of truth is the wrong word, a kernel of reality in that, which was just how difficult this was and just how radical this proposal that President Bush put on the table, which is to say, no, actually, despite all those challenges, we're going to get the medicines to them. So I wanted to highlight that because it does make the story even more remarkable. Today, it seems like, well, obviously we can do it. Back then, was not at all obvious.
Right. Well, I wanted to lift up because, in full disclosure, I am active in the One campaign myself. Congressional advocate, I believe, is the term that's being used.
Yep.
And my connection is Leocadia Tuafe, who has been working on organizing the African diaspora in the United States. And it is true that the idea that one of the things that has been something I've been highlighting in my conversations with folks about One is the fact that it's so active in Africa, and that the people who are activists in the One campaign have often, or I don't know how often, but some have gone on to run for political office and do change making in their communities, partly as a result of the experience of being an advocate through this organization. So that I think is super impressive and cool.
Well, I'm glad that you raised that. I do think one of the things that gets us most excited in the staff is to meet and work with and train our volunteers. It really is it's a piece of democracy. We are trying to help provide the issues and the training, the information and the training for how to engage our government to make real change. And I've been fortunate enough over 20 years to see how some of that change has really been manifest. And it's just really fun to see people take something that they're passionate about, that they've read about, and then actually be able to engage a process over time and make the difference that they want. So thank you for being a volunteer. I really appreciate it. But it also is, I agree with you. I think it's a real act of, of supporting our democracy, frankly, to keep people engaged.
What does it look like? Compare and contrast, if you would, and I understand you probably need to be diplomatic with the work that you do, but
yeah, sometimes.
I feel like there's just in my, though I was not terribly paying attention to the political scene in 2003, I do feel like there's probably some differences in the ways that the conversations happen around these sort of nonpartisan efforts. Has it become more challenging when it's coming clearly from just a practical standpoint, like these are people who are dying and we can help keep them from dying, and we can be a source of good in the world?
Well, your question was very diplomatic. Well done. I will be slightly less diplomatic, which is to say it was easier back then to get Republicans and Democrats around a common table and negotiate and compromise, that dirty word. Like, it is really, I'm not sure that we could get PEPFAR passed today. In fact, I'm convinced that we couldn't. We had some hard fights. You had the pro-life caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus. You have challenges between on prevention, it was this famous debate over ABC: abstinence, be faithful within marriage, and condoms. And to be blunt about it, the Democrats were all for more condoms, more condoms, more condoms. The Republicans were saying no, if just abstinence or be faithful in the marriage. Like, and obviously it takes all three and much, much more, to be honest, for a successful prevention program like this. But that was a really hard fought and earnest debate. And folks rolled up their sleeves and said, you know what, we're not going to agree on how to balance this, but the broader goal of saving lives is one that we share, and we're going to get it done. There were lots of debates like that. And I think what's changed is back, I mean, I sound so old. Back then, things were different. God, my kids would just laugh at me. There was a real political value to being bipartisan and to negotiate and compromise.
Right.
Members of Congress were in districts that were often quite purple. Right. And so they needed to show, that they were certainly loyal to their party values, but they often were reaching across the aisle to show some of those swing voters, to pull them over. So there was a political and value to, being seen that way. And that's it was an opportunity that we really tried to leverage. That is less so now. Congressional districts and states are much more Republican or more Democratic. With social media, there's much less opportunity to try to negotiate and compromise and come out with solutions that will work for both sides, or solutions that make both sides equally mad, right? Like, sometimes that's the best you can get for a higher purpose. So it is really a challenge now for an organization that is continued to be committed to bipartisanship, to bring those two sides together, because there's just less of a political interest in doing so.
So what are some of the ways that the One campaign is getting the word out about PEPFAR and advocating on its behalf? And what are some of the ways that PEPFAR does not look the same as it did then? I'm sure there is a lot more happened in besides the technical challenges have shifted.
They have.
I know that there are much more robust, like youth-led and community-led organizations that are taking more of a lead now. So tell me more about that.
Well, PEPFAR has evolved a great deal, obviously, in 20 years. Some of us think that they maybe should change their name because it's the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And indeed, that was correct. In 2002 and 3 and 4, when we were working on this, it was an emergency. And it was about, oh my gosh, there's a fire. We need to get the fire out. Obviously, the fire is not out, but the nature of the pandemic, or the pandemic has changed. Before, it was, a generalized pandemic in countries. And so, I hate to say this, but it's the only illustration I can go with. The low-hanging fruit was there. Mm-hmm. It was like, get as many drugs and as many, preventative measures there as quickly as possible. We definitely, PEPFAR broke some crockery in doing so, but they really found and got treatment to a large number of people and scaled up very, very quickly. That, as I said, the nature of the epidemic has shifted. It's now 20 years on. It has become more rural. It's become more concentrated in vulnerable populations like LGBTQ, sex workers, others. Younger women are extraordinarily vulnerable to HIV because their male partners can sometimes be older and don't know their status, and so spread it to several people. So the prevention and the societal knowing how to work in a society and a community to get people to come and get tested and then treated is definitely one of the bigger challenges that we've seen with the evolving epidemic.
Is there a particular success story that we can end on a hopeful note here?
Oh yeah, I mean, it is one thing is PEPFAR created something called the Dreams program as part of it, which is about adolescent girls. And I've seen these programs on the ground where you've got adolescent girls extraordinarily vulnerable, either due to economic or other societal reasons, have have caught HIV, and how they become community leaders in coaching and mentoring and advising their peers how to avoid contracting the disease, and if they do, how to get help and treatment, and the courage in the face of stigma and social pressure and shunning and family pressure is just the heroism there is really inspiring. So as much as I compliment George W. Bush and the political leaders and the activists like us who help get this thing going, the real heroes are the people on the ground who are implementing this every day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I'll let you get back to the hard work that you are doing, and we will make sure to highlight one.org as a place people should go to learn more.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Angela. I really appreciate the great conversation.
Thank you.
Zooming in, zooming out.